SWF or Survive with Friends accounts for 70% of all matches played in Dead by Daylight. Now, if you are like me, you've probably been told that the vast majority of all of your matches are solo queue, or maybe you saw one of the numerous posts that have circulated for years about how solo queue makes up the vast majority of the player base, and killer players specifically just use SWFs as an excuse for their own poor play. However, if you actually look into the truth, it's very different, and it seems this might be a severe community-wide example of the Mandela effect, in large part due to a lot of very manipulative individuals purposely spreading these false stats over the years. Even I've been guilty of this, but never on purpose, which I'm sure a lot of you have too. So if I asked you, when was the last time the devs actually officially mentioned survivor group distribution between solo queue and SWF? Would you know the answer? Take a second and think about it. Okay, if you guessed 2017, you'd be correct. More specifically, October of 2017 was the last official information provided specifically on this topic, which was only 5 months after SWF was added to the game.
So there it goes. I mean, it's interesting. You can do whatever you want with this.
It just goes to show how many different potential matchups you have. I mean,
yes,
that's a balance issue, obviously.
So only 5 months in, and 70% of matches contained a SWF, with only 30% of matches actually being solo queue only, meaning 4 solo players. In 2019, we got a small update that the player base was still split equally between solo queue and SWF, but nothing about match distribution, so we can only assume that it was still around 70%. Now, keep in mind, this information is now nearly a decade old. We've been in a significantly more competitive version of DBD for years at this point. Solo queue has become significantly more miserable for a huge chunk of the player base, so there's no denying that playing in a SWF has been encouraged by the current balance of the game and the huge addition of MMR. Which, speaking of MMR, which is your hidden rank used for matchmaking if you don't know, don't forget that SWFs have an enormous MMR gain modifier, meaning when a SWF escapes in a match, the MMR system gives them way more MMR gain than if they were playing alone and escaped. I talked about this before. Stream sniping hackers would always boost their MMR in 4-man SWFs because it was significantly faster MMR gain with a new account than if they were doing it alone, and that allowed them to quickly get back up to high MMR so they could go back to stream sniping. So with that information, we know that decent SWFs are going to migrate to higher MMR brackets at a much faster rate than solo queue players. Also, keep in mind, these boosted SWF players will still be in high MMR if they search in solo queue later on, which could explain how a lot of very average players make it into high MMR in the first place. So this entire killers are on copium thing when they're playing against a SWF, it's very disingenuous because chances are it is a SWF, especially if that killer is in high MMR. Now you might ask, why wouldn't Behavior just release some updated stats on this after nearly a decade? Well, the obvious answer is they probably want to keep the information hidden, right? We know for sure they're still tracking the data internally, but they're keeping it under wraps. So let's try to break down why that might be. The first reason is community backlash. If they show that the vast majority of matches have SWFs, then killers are going to start demanding balance changes around that, right? I mean, killers have always been demanding balance changes related to SWF, but now they'll actually have ground to stand on. The next reason is Behavior is very selective with the stats that they show, and typically they release very calculated stats to support certain balance changes they've made or are planning on making to the game. So they use the stats to reinforce the narrative of what they're trying to do. And usually they keep those stats vague enough to confuse and manipulate the community. Another possibility though is that Behavior feels like SWF stats are possibly too volatile to share accurately. For example, maybe OC servers have way less SWFs, maybe EU has way more SWFs, and US servers are somewhere in between. Maybe there's way more SWFs at night than during the day where people are working or at school, so it's harder to form those bigger groups. Like, there's a lot of shifting elements to a stat like this, and it could be that they just don't want the community to beat each other up with the stats, especially if the stats are somehow inherently flawed due to all the caveats. So that is a legit possibility, but then again, if the stats are volatile, they could just show us all the data so we could account for region and time of day or whatever else there is. If they know it's volatile, then that means they have the data, so just go ahead and show it. That said, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Behavior would rather saw off their own legs than ever consider some kind of reasonable nerf to SWF, and anything that might promote public opinion into demanding a SWF nerf is DEFCON 5 levels of fear for the company. If 50% of your player base is choosing to play in a SWF, the last thing you would ever want to do is upset the gravy train, right? A good example of this is the recently deceased Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, which at launch allowed you to see the team compositions of who was in a pre-made group, and as you may have guessed, the vast majority of every lobby had a pre-made group in it. And this was such a problem that the devs patched this feature out of the game because solo players would dodge every pre-made lobby to the point where the game became virtually unplayable. The TCM devs also banned SWFs outright from playing their new mode Rush Week because they knew that that would break the balance of the game mode and they just didn't want to deal with it. But overall, I don't want this video to overly focus on balance, just that this metric has been lied about for way too long. There hasn't been an official word from Behavior on this since October of 2017, and if the devs aren't going to update it, that's fine, but let's stop with the current BS lie that the vast majority of the player base is solo queue when it's a 50-50 split and 70% of matches have a SWF in it. I think this might also spark a new conversation. If the vast majority of matches truly have SWFs, then wouldn't that mean that SWF isn't actually as strong as people think they are? Because if that were the case, then survivors would have like a 70% escape rate, right? But in my opinion, this actually makes a lot of sense. The problem isn't inherently SWF, it's optimized SWFs. Groups that pick 4 great survivor players and optimize their builds to counter every possible situation in the game. And the fact that SWF escape rates are not that much higher than solo queue just basically shows that the stats are being dragged down by inoptimal SWFs, kind of in the same way that nerfs usually has an extremely low kill rate, right? Finally, a message for Behavior directly. I think most of us in the DBD community would appreciate way more transparency when it comes to stats. Even if the data's messy or complicated, giving the community a clear picture would finally help move these age-old conversations forward because they do get exhausting. Alright, with that, let me know, were you also suffering from the Mandela effect, or do you just feel that maybe you got manipulated by the community? And as always, thanks so much for watching and have a good one.